Why hasn't the IRS gone after churches for supporting political candidates? IRS Form 13909 enables citizens to report abuses of 503c3 status, and then Form 211 allows that citizen to collect a reward. Whether this will actually happen if you file them is an open question, but the laws are on the books. In 2013, some IRS agents figured it was an easy case that anything with the name Tea Party calling themselves tax-free and operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare wasn't the case, freaked conservatives out and got the agents fired, as well as multiple years of conservatives investigating and cutting IRS funding. See Wiki for IRS targeting controversy. Basically, they are afraid to. They are not going to compensate you unless you somehow come across a smoking gun that directly leads to them collecting a large amount of delinquent taxes. The contention over how much political activity a church is allowed to support is beside the point. Everybody knows churches do this shit. The IRS is not in a position, politically, to take much action. The IRS is so criminally understaffed I can't say I'm terribly surprised. They don't have enough people to go audit the billionaires, leaving an untold amount of taxes uncollected. That means probably even less time to go after churches, which isn't a great look for optics anyhow. Just so you know, ChatGPT is really not a good source for that. It has and will just make things up, especially in regard to law. I'm sure they're surely not going to open the hornet's nest. Can you imagine the born again right wing? The IRS is going after churches, saying we're businesses now. They will close our doors. This is un-American. Next they'll come for our Bibles. Defund the IRS. Complete political suicide to go after churches. Unions get away with it also. Most of them have 501c3 status. More or less it's down to the idea that the churches that are big enough to be worth going after are careful about how they do it such that they stay just inside the law. Likewise, the most flagrant violators aren't worth going after because it'd be trying to get blood from a turnip. The problem isn't one of enforcement, it's something we need new regulation to change. It also probably wouldn't make as big a difference as you'd imagine it might, either in terms of tax revenue or stopping religious influence in politics. Because churches aren't stupid, they know what they can do or can't. They're not required to avoid discussing politics. They won't preach from the pulpit that you should vote for X or Y candidate. But they'll talk about specific issues and beliefs, and when you learn what candidates X and Y think about those topics, you'll draw your own conclusions about who someone of your religion ought to vote for. Charities such as churches are also allowed to engage in a limited amount of lobbying, which means advocating for or against specific laws rather than about specific candidates, which is distinguished as *electioneering*. Also, keep in mind that political organizations can still be tax exempt in other 501c categories. For example, political parties and candidates' campaigns are exempt. The most important difference is that donations to 501c3 organizations are deductible for the donor. You can have it both ways if you keep the money separate. The same people might donate to a charity that follows the 501c3 restrictions, and also to a PAC or other entity that doesn't have to. It really would not make any difference anyway. Back when we were a functioning democracy, the idea was that a tax-exempt entity should not be a conduit for political money and influence, but since Citizens United, does it really matter? What are you talking about ChatGPT for? You know that's not a valid source of information. Do they publicly? Everyone and their dead grandmothers can tell who my preacher supports, but he has never actually said anything behind the pulpit. Because it's a very sensitive topic in the US and will cause unneeded backlash. It's happened before in our history. It has to be done with care. There's a reason right-wingers use the government's coming for the church propaganda rhetoric. It's actually a really strong single-issue factor when it comes to getting people to vote for Trump, even if he's miles less religious than even your most left establishment Democrat most likely. Even some of my more level-headed family members who have been Christian or are Christian can't evade right-wing rhetoric that Christians are always the victim, which is insane. 64% of Americans are Christian. Because they don't want it going to the Supreme Court, that's why. https://en.m.wiki.org/wiki/pulpit_freedom_Sunday. I'm sure plenty of people are swarming to do this already, perhaps. Just as I'm sure churches are working to hide these tithings and charitable givings. Great question. I think they are afraid of the publicity they would get if they did. But I would stand by them. I believe many so-called religious should lose their tax exemptions for many reasons. Because they have too much money and power. It would create major political problems for the IRS if they did. Both political parties depend on churches. Black churches do a lot of mobilization of Democratic voters. Because low to middle income people are easier to make pay, that's who the IRS targets for audits. Rich people fight them in court. A church will either have very little for the IRS to take, or they'll be wealthy enough to fight them. Because that's where corrupt people launder their money and evade taxes.